My wife died 30 years ago and left behind a locked wooden box. She'd kept it on the closet shelf our entire marriage. Never let me see inside, said it was personal things from before we met. I respected her privacy. Never asked again. The box moved with me through 3 different houses over 30 years. Yesterday, my daughter found it while cleaning the attic and brought it down. I finally opened it. What I found destroyed everything I believed about my marriage. Before that, tell us where you're watching from and what time it is there right now. And please subscribe to this channel so that my stories can reach more people, their husbands to learn from, the kind of man who never gave his wife a single reason to doubt or worry or feel anything less than completely chosen. I worked hard at my job as an accountant for 40 years, came home every single night without stopping anywhere else, never went out with colleagues for drinks, never had hobbies that took me away from home, never gave her any reason to wonder where I was or what I was doing. My entire life was built around her and our marriage, and I thought that's what love looked like, thought that's what commitment meant, thought I was doing everything right. I never raised my voice to her in 35 years of marriage, never started an argument, never criticized her cooking or her appearance or her choices, just supported everything she did and wanted and needed without complaint. When she wanted to redecorate the house, I worked overtime to pay for it. When she wanted to go back to school, I encouraged her and helped with household tasks so she'd have time to study. When she wanted to visit her family across the country, I drove her there and picked her up without making her feel guilty about the expense or time. I thought I was being a good husband, thought I was showing her how much I loved her, thought I was building something solid and permanent. Other men in our social circle would complain about their wives, would make jokes about marriage being a burden or wives being controlling, but I never joined in because I genuinely loved being married to her. I loved coming home to her, loved having dinner together, loved the quiet routine of our life, loved knowing I had a partner to share everything with. Friends would say I was whipped or too devoted, would tease me about being under her thumb, but I didn't care because I was proud of my marriage, proud of the life we'd built. Proud that I'd never given her reason to doubt my faithfulness or commitment. I never looked at other women, not once in 35 years of marriage, never let my eyes wander or my mind go places it shouldn't, never entertained fantasies about what life might be like with someone else. When attractive women came into my office or approached me at social events, I was polite but distant, made it clear I was married and devoted, never crossed any line or even came close to crossing one. My coworkers used to joke that I was the most faithful man they'd ever met, that my wife was lucky to have someone so completely dedicated, and I'd smile because I felt like I was the lucky one. I handled all our finances because she said numbers gave her headaches, paid all the bills on time, managed our savings and investments, made sure we were building toward a comfortable retirement. I gave her access to everything, never hid money or made financial decisions without discussing them with her first, always made sure she had everything she needed and most of what she wanted. We weren't wealthy, but we were comfortable because I was careful with money, because I worked hard and saved diligently, because I wanted to give her security and stability. I took care of her when she was sick, sat with her through illnesses and medical procedures, held her hand and brought her soup and made sure she had whatever would make her feel better. When she had surgery 10 years into our marriage, I took 2 weeks off work to care for her, did all the cooking and cleaning and nursing without complaint, just wanted her to heal and be comfortable. She'd told me I was the best husband she could have asked for, and I'd believed her, had thought we were building something beautiful together. I never forgot our anniversary or her birthday, always planned something special, even if it was just a nice dinner or a small gift. Always made sure she knew I was thinking about her and valued our relationship. I brought her flowers for no reason, left notes telling her I loved her, did small things to show I cared about making her happy. I thought these gestures mattered, thought they were building a foundation of love and appreciation, thought she felt as cherished as I'd intended her to feel. When friends' marriages fell apart, I'd feel grateful that ours was solid, that we didn't fight or cheat or have the drama that seemed to destroy so many relationships. I'd see divorced men at work looking miserable and lonely, and I'd feel lucky that I had someone to go home to, someone who'd chosen me and stayed with me, someone I could trust completely. I never questioned whether she loved me back the same way I loved her, because why would I? She was there, she stayed, she seemed content with our life, and I had no reason to doubt that we were both equally invested. I gave her 35 years of faithfulness, so complete and pure that it never occurred to me to question what she was giving back. Never occurred to me that maybe my devotion wasn't matched. Never occurred to me that a person could accept all that love and loyalty while feeling completely different inside. I'd built my entire adult life around being a good husband to her, around making her happy and secure, around proving every single day through my actions that she'd made the right choice in marrying me. Looking back now, I can see I was naive, can see I was so focused on being perfect for her that I never stopped to examine whether she was trying to be perfect for me. Never questioned whether our marriage was as solid as I believed it was. I'd given her everything I had to give, every ounce of loyalty and devotion and love, and I'd assumed that kind of commitment was mutual, that she was giving me the same thing back. I worked every day believing we were building something together, believing we were partners in every sense, believing the life we had was what we both wanted. The box had sat on our closet shelf through all of that, through 35 years of me being the perfect husband, through decades of faithfulness and devotion and complete trust. She'd kept it locked, and I'd respected that boundary because I thought respecting her privacy was part of being a good husband, thought giving her space for her own things was healthy, thought it showed I trusted her completely. I never imagined what that box actually contained, never suspected that the woman I was being so devoted to was keeping secrets that would destroy everything I believed about our marriage. My wife died 30 years ago from cancer. A slow, painful death that took her over the course of 18 months, and I sat with her through every treatment and every setback and every moment of suffering until the end. She'd been 58 when she died, and I'd been 60, both of us too young for this kind of loss, both of us having expected decades more together. I'd held her hand in that hospital room when she took her last breath, had cried like I'd never cried before, had felt like half of myself had died with her because she'd been my entire adult life, my whole world, my reason for everything. After she died, I'd gone through her things slowly and carefully, packing up clothes to donate and sorting through papers and trying to figure out how to live alone after 35 years of marriage. I'd found that locked wooden box on the closet shelf during that process, had stood there holding it and remembering how she'd always kept it private, had decided that respecting her privacy even after death felt like the right thing to do. She'd told me years ago it contained personal things from before we met, mementos and memories that were hers alone, and I'd thought keeping it locked was a way of honoring her wishes, a way of showing I still respected her boundaries, even though she was gone. The box had moved with me when I'd sold our house 2 years after her death, because living there without her was too painful, had moved again when I'd downsized to a smaller place 5 years after that, had moved a third time when I'd relocated to be closer to our daughter 10 years ago. Every time I packed and unpacked it, I'd think about opening it, would hold it and wonder what was inside, but something always stopped me. Some feeling that opening it would be a violation of trust, that she'd kept it locked for a reason and I should respect that reason forever. I'd built a quiet life alone over those 30 years, had never remarried or even dated because no one could replace her, had focused on being a good grandfather to my daughter's children and staying involved in my community and filling my days with activities that kept me from feeling too lonely. I'd kept photos of her around my house, had visited her grave regularly, had talked to her sometimes when I was alone like she could still hear me, had maintained this connection to a woman I'd loved completely and lost too soon. The locked box had been part of that connection, a physical reminder that she'd had parts of herself I'd never fully known, that even in a long marriage people keep some things private. My daughter Sarah had come over yesterday to help me clean out the attic because at 88 I couldn't manage climbing up there anymore, couldn't handle moving boxes and sorting through decades of accumulated stuff without help. She'd been up there for about an hour pulling things down when she'd called down, asking if I knew what was in the old wooden box, said it was heavy and locked and looked like it had been up there for years. I'd told her to bring it down, had felt my stomach clench when she'd placed it on my kitchen table because I knew exactly what it was. Knew it had been on that closet shelf before moving to the attic at some point. Knew I'd been avoiding it for 3 decades. Sarah had asked if I wanted her to help me open it, and I'd said no, had told her I needed to do this alone, had waited until she'd left before I really looked at it for the first time in years. The box was old and dusty, the wood was dark and worn, the lock was small and brass and still holding firm after all these decades. I'd remembered my wife had kept the key on a separate ring, not with her regular keys but hidden away somewhere, and I'd spent an hour searching through drawers until I'd found it in an old jewelry box I'd also kept from her things. I'd sat at the kitchen table with the box in front of me and the key in my hand for 2 hours before I could make myself actually use it, kept thinking about whether I really wanted to know what was inside, whether some secrets were better left buried, whether opening this box would change how I remembered her. Part of me wanted to just put it back in the attic unopened, wanted to preserve the memory of our marriage without whatever complications might be hidden inside, wanted to die someday still believing she'd loved me the way I'd loved her. But another part of me needed to know, needed to understand whatever she'd kept locked away for our entire marriage, needed to finally see what had been important enough to hide but not important enough to destroy. I'd been faithful to her memory for 30 years the same way I'd been faithful to her in life, had built my whole understanding of myself around being her devoted husband, and if there was something in this box that contradicted that understanding, then maybe I deserved to know before I died. I'd put the key in the lock and turned it slowly, heard the mechanism click after 3 decades of being sealed, felt the lid loosen under my hands as I lifted it carefully. I'd thought I would find old letters maybe, or photographs from before we met, or journal entries about her life before marriage, things that were personal but not necessarily devastating. I'd imagined finding pieces of her past that would help me understand her better, that would give me new insights into the woman I'd loved, that would make me feel closer to her even 30 years after her death. But when I'd opened that box and seen what was actually inside, when I'd started going through the contents layer by layer, I'd realized immediately that I'd been completely wrong about what I'd find. This wasn't a collection of innocent mementos from her past, wasn't a treasure box of memories she'd wanted to keep private, wasn't anything that would make me feel closer to her or help me understand her better. This was something else entirely. Something that would destroy 30 years of grieving and 65 years of memories and every belief I'd held about who she was and what our marriage had meant. My hands had started shaking as I'd looked at the first layer of contents. My breathing had gotten shallow and fast, and I'd felt this terrible sinking feeling in my stomach as I'd begun to understand what I was looking at. This box wasn't about preserving her privacy or keeping innocent secrets. This box was about hiding things she'd never wanted me to know, things that would have destroyed our marriage if I'd found them while she was alive, things she'd taken to her grave because telling the truth would have cost her everything. On top of everything else in the box were documents, official-looking papers with bank letterheads and legal language, and I'd pulled them out carefully trying to understand what I was looking at. They were loan documents from multiple banks. Personal loans taken out over a span of years, each one showing amounts that made my hands go cold as I read them. $5,000 from one bank, $10,000 from another, $15,000 from a third, each loan dated and signed and processed through official channels, each one showing both our names as co-borrowers, even though I'd never signed anything, never applied for these loans, never even known they existed. I'd gone through them one by one, my confusion turning to horror as I'd realized these weren't mistakes or identity theft. These were deliberate loans my wife had taken out using forged signatures, using my income information without my knowledge, using our marriage and joint credit to borrow money I'd never agreed to borrow. The signatures that were supposed to be mine were close enough to pass a bank's casual inspection, but I could see they weren't actually my handwriting, could see the small differences in how letters were formed, could see evidence of someone practicing my signature until they could reproduce it well enough to fool a loan officer. The dates on these loans spanned 11 years of our marriage, starting about 8 years after we'd gotten married and continuing until about 3 years before she died, which meant for more than a decade she'd been systematically borrowing money behind my back and hiding the evidence in this locked box. I'd sat at that table, adding up the amounts with a calculator and shaking hands, watching the total climb higher and higher as I included each new loan document, each new amount she'd borrowed without telling me, each new debt she'd hidden from the husband who'd trusted her completely, The total when I'd finished adding everything was devastating. More than $80,000 in loans I'd never known existed, borrowed across 11 years while I'd been working and budgeting and thinking we were building financial security together. I'd spent years after her death wondering why our finances had never quite balanced the way I'd expected them to. Why there'd always seemed to be less money than there should have been given our income and expenses. Why retirement had looked less secure than my careful planning should have made it. Now, I had the answer. She'd been draining our finances secretly, while I'd been working overtime trying to build something stable. I'd found payment records too, tucked in with the loan documents, showing she'd been making minimum payments on these loans using money from our joint accounts, but disguising the payments as other expenses. Grocery shopping that cost twice what groceries should cost. Clothing purchases that seemed excessive. Medical expenses that I'd never questioned because I'd trusted her to manage the day-to-day finances. She'd been skimming money from our household budget systematically, taking a little here and a little there, amounts small enough that I wouldn't notice but large enough to keep these secret loans from defaulting. The interest rates on these loans were terrible, 15 or 20%, the kind of predatory rates that banks charge for unsecured personal loans, which meant she'd been paying thousands in interest alone over the years. I'd calculated roughly that she'd probably paid $20,000 or $30,000 just in interest on loans I'd never known about. Money that could have gone into our retirement or our daughter's education or anything useful instead of being wasted on servicing secret debt. The financial waste was staggering, but it wasn't what hurt most. What hurt was the systematic deception, the years of lying, the deliberate choice to hide this from me while I'd been working so hard to provide for us. I'd sat there trying to understand what she could have possibly needed $80,000 for, what could have been so important that she'd risked our financial security and forged my signature and lied for 11 years to get it. We'd lived modestly, hadn't had expensive hobbies or tastes, hadn't bought luxury items or taken extravagant vacations, so where had all this money gone? What had she been spending it on that was worth this level of deception and risk? The loan documents didn't answer that question, just showed the borrowing without explaining the purpose, just proved she'd been stealing from our marriage without showing what she'd stolen for. I'd known I needed to keep looking through the box, needed to find out what else was hidden there, needed to understand the full scope of what my wife had been keeping from me. The loan documents were devastating, but they were just the first layer, just the top of whatever secrets this box contained, and I'd had this terrible sinking feeling that whatever was underneath would be worse, would explain where the money went, would show me things I didn't want to know but needed to understand. I'd taken a deep breath and reached back into the box, ready to face whatever came next. Beneath the loan documents were receipts, hundreds of them tucked into envelopes organized by year, and I'd started going through them trying to understand what my wife had been spending all that borrowed money on. The first envelope I opened was from 15 years ago, labeled in her handwriting with just a year, and inside were receipts from hotels, nice hotels in cities we'd never visited together, charges for rooms that cost $200 or $300 a night for weekends. I remembered her saying she was visiting her sister or going to conferences for work. I'd pulled out receipt after receipt showing hotel stays I'd never known about, room service charges, bar tabs, all dated to weekends or weeks when I'd believed she was somewhere else doing something innocent. There were restaurant receipts too, expensive places charging $100 or more for dinners for two, romantic restaurants in cities where she'd claimed to be alone visiting family, proof that she'd been dining with someone while telling me she was eating cheap meals with her sister. I'd found receipts for gifts I'd never seen her bring home, jewelry purchases from stores I'd never heard of, expensive watches and necklaces, and items that had clearly been bought for someone else because she'd never worn anything like that, had always preferred simple jewelry, and had never shown me anything this extravagant. The amounts on these gift receipts were staggering, $500 here, $1,000 there, money borrowed from banks through forged signatures being spent on gifts for someone who wasn't me. I'd found travel receipts showing plane tickets to cities across the country, rental car charges, proof of trips she'd never mentioned taking, evidence of a whole separate life I'd known nothing about. Some of these trips corresponded with times she'd said she was visiting her mother who lived alone across the state. Times I'd stayed home working while she'd supposedly been helping with her mother's medical appointments or house maintenance. But these receipts showed she'd been flying to completely different cities and staying in hotels and living a life that had nothing to do with family obligations. The deception was so thorough and systematic that I felt sick looking at it, seeing proof that she'd been lying about basic facts of where she was and what she was doing for years. There were receipts for weekend getaways to beach resorts and mountain cabins, romantic destinations where couples go to be alone together, all during times when I'd thought she was somewhere else entirely. I'd remembered those weekends clearly, remembered her calling me from her mother's house or her sister's place, remembered believing her completely when she'd said she was helping family or attending work events, remembered never once suspecting that she was actually in a resort somewhere with someone else. The betrayal felt overwhelming, not just that she'd been unfaithful, but that she'd been so calculated about it, so careful in her deception, so skilled at living two completely different lives without me ever suspecting. I'd started adding up the hotel and restaurant and gift receipts, watching the total climb toward the $80,000 in loans, and I'd realized this was where all that borrowed money had gone. It had funded a secret life of hotels and romantic dinners and expensive gifts for someone who wasn't her husband. She'd been using forged loan documents and stolen household money to pay for an affair, had been systematically draining our finances to fund betrayal, had been lying to banks and to me in order to maintain whatever relationship she'd been hiding. The financial fraud was bad enough, but knowing what it had paid for made it so much worse. Made it clear that every dollar she'd stolen had been spent on destroying our marriage. I'd found receipts for lingerie from expensive stores, items she'd definitely never worn for me because I'd have remembered, proof that she'd been buying intimate items for encounters with someone else. There were receipts for champagne and flowers and all the romantic gestures I'd thought were reserved for our marriage, except she'd been performing those gestures for someone else using money she'd stolen from our joint future. I'd given her 35 years of complete faithfulness and devotion while she'd been spending borrowed money on romance with another man, had been working overtime to provide security while she'd been forging my signature to fund infidelity. The receipts painted a clear picture of sustained deception spanning more than a decade, not a one-time mistake or a brief affair, but a long-term parallel relationship that required constant lying and financial fraud to maintain. She'd built an entire secret life funded by debt and deception, had chosen repeatedly over years to keep betraying me rather than either ending the affair or ending our marriage, had decided that maintaining both relationships was worth the lies and the financial damage and the risk of discovery. I'd been living with someone who was essentially a stranger, someone capable of this level of systematic betrayal while coming home and acting like a normal wife. Beneath all the receipts, I found letters, actual handwritten letters on nice paper, dozens of them folded carefully and tied together with a ribbon like they were precious treasures worth preserving. I'd picked up the bundle with hands that were shaking badly now, had untied the ribbon slowly, had pulled out the first letter and seen immediately that it wasn't addressed to me, wasn't in my handwriting, was from someone else writing to my wife with an intimacy that made my chest hurt before I'd even started reading the actual words. The letters were all from the same man, every single one signed with the same name at the bottom, a name I recognized because he'd been someone my wife worked with for years, someone I'd met at office parties and company events, someone who'd shaken my hand and smiled at me while apparently sleeping with my wife behind my back. His name was David, and I'd thought he was just a colleague, just someone she worked with in the same department, had never suspected there was anything between them, because why would I? I'd trusted her completely and had no reason to think her co-workers were anything more than professional relationships. I'd started reading the letters in chronological order based on the dates written at the top, watching their relationship develop on paper from friendly correspondence to something much more intimate, seeing the progression from co-worker to lover spelled out in his handwriting. The earliest letters were from about 12 years into our marriage, right around the time the first loan documents showed she'd started borrowing money, and they started off fairly innocent, just friendly notes about work projects and office gossip, nothing that would have seemed inappropriate if I'd found them back then. But the letters got more personal quickly. Within a few months he was writing about missing her on weekends, about thinking about her constantly, about wanting to see her outside of work, and her responses must have encouraged him because his letters became increasingly romantic and explicit. He wrote about the first time they'd kissed in his car after work, about how he'd been wanting to do that for months, about how she'd told him she felt the same way, about how they'd both agreed they needed to be careful because she was married and he was going through a divorce, but neither of them could resist the connection they felt. The letters documented their entire affair in detail that was painful to read. He wrote about hotel rooms they'd met in, about weekends they'd stolen together while I'd thought she was visiting family, about how much he loved her and wanted to be with her properly instead of sneaking around. He wrote about the gifts he'd bought her using her money, about dinners they'd had at romantic restaurants, about trips they'd taken to places I'd never been invited to. Everything I'd seen receipts for was confirmed in his letters, describing those same events from his perspective as her lover. He wrote about feeling guilty sometimes about the affair, about knowing it was wrong to be with a married woman, but then he'd write about how their connection was too strong to resist, how what they had was real love, unlike her marriage, which he described as her being trapped with a man she didn't love anymore. That phrase appeared multiple times in his letters. He kept referring to me as the man she was trapped with, the obligation she couldn't escape, the burden of a marriage she'd outgrown but didn't know how to leave. He wrote about encouraging her to divorce me, about offering to wait for her while she figured out how to end her marriage, about wanting a future together that didn't involve sneaking around. But she'd apparently never been willing to leave. Based on his letters, she'd kept telling him she couldn't divorce me yet, that the timing wasn't right, that she needed to wait for some unspecified perfect moment that never came. He'd written frustrated letters about this, about feeling like her permanent secret instead of her actual partner, about wanting more than stolen weekends and hotel rooms, about being tired of hearing my name and pretending I didn't exist when he was with her. The frustration in his letters showed he'd wanted her to choose him, wanted her to end our marriage and commit to their relationship properly, but she'd never done it, had kept stringing him along while staying married to me. I'd found letters from him spanning nearly 15 years, ending about 5 years before she died, which meant their affair had lasted most of our marriage and had apparently ended while she was still alive. The last few letters showed the relationship falling apart, him writing about how he couldn't do this anymore, how he'd met someone else who was actually available, how he was sorry, but he needed a real relationship instead of being someone's permanent secret. Her last letter back to him must have been desperate based on his response, where he'd written that he'd loved her but couldn't keep waiting for her to choose him, that 15 years was long enough to waste on someone who'd never leave her husband. The letters weren't just about their affair and their relationship, they were also about me, about my wife's husband who apparently was the obstacle to their happiness, and reading what this man wrote about me while having an affair with my wife was devastating in ways I hadn't expected. David had written about meeting me at office parties, about shaking my hand and making small talk while knowing he was sleeping with my wife, about how guilty he'd felt sometimes seeing how nice I was, how devoted I seemed to her, how completely unaware I was of what was happening behind my back. He'd written that I seemed like a good man, which made the affair feel worse, that it would have been easier if I'd been a terrible husband who deserved to be betrayed. But then he'd also written things that were cruel and dismissive, had described me as boring and predictable based on what my wife had apparently told him about our marriage, had made jokes about how I was too devoted and too available and too focused on being a good husband. He'd written about conversations where my wife had complained about me, about how she'd said I was suffocating even though I never did anything wrong, about how my faithfulness felt like pressure rather than comfort, about how she felt trapped by my devotion because it meant she couldn't leave without being the villain. He'd written all of this like it was reasonable, like being a faithful, devoted husband was somehow a flaw that justified her cheating. He'd described specific things about me that my wife had told him, intimate details about our marriage and our life together that she shouldn't have been sharing with anyone, definitely not with the man she was having an affair with. She'd told him about my work habits, about how I came home every night and never went out with friends, about how I never looked at other women or gave her any reason not to trust me. And David had written about these things like they were negatives, like my faithfulness was boring, like my devotion was somehow weak rather than strong. He'd written that she deserved someone more exciting than her predictable husband, someone who challenged her instead of just supporting her, someone who made her feel alive instead of comfortable. The letters showed that my wife had been complaining about our marriage to her lover for years, had been painting me as the problem even though I'd never done anything to deserve that characterization, had been using my good qualities as evidence that our marriage was wrong. She'd apparently told David that I was too good, that being married to someone who never gave her problems or drama felt stifling, that she needed passion and excitement instead of steady, reliable love. He'd written back agreeing with her, had encouraged her dissatisfaction with me, had told her she deserved better than a husband who was merely kind and faithful and devoted. I'd found letters where David had written about seeing us together at company events, about watching me be attentive to my wife and thinking about how she'd rather be with him, about the thrill of their secret while I stood there oblivious holding her coat or bringing her drinks. He'd written about one particular party where I'd told someone how lucky I felt to be married to her, how much I loved her, and he described watching her face during that conversation and seeing her look uncomfortable rather than happy, seeing her wish she was anywhere else instead of being praised by her boring, devoted husband. He'd written about times when my wife had canceled plans with him at the last minute because I'd done something unexpected, had surprised her with flowers or planned a special dinner, and instead of being touched by those gestures, she'd been annoyed because they interfered with her affair. David had written sympathetically about how hard it must be for her to have a husband who was always trying to be romantic and thoughtful when what she really wanted was to be with him, how my attempts to show love must have felt like obligations she had to pretend to appreciate. The cruelty of that perspective was staggering, the idea that my efforts to be a good husband had been burdens to her rather than gifts. I'd found a letter where David had written about a conversation where my wife had cried about feeling guilty. Not guilty about the affair, but guilty about not being able to love me the way I deserved to be loved, guilty that such a good man had wasted his devotion on someone who couldn't return it. He'd written trying to comfort her, telling her it wasn't her fault that she'd married too young and chosen security over passion, that she shouldn't feel bad about finding real love later, even if the circumstances were complicated. He'd absolved her of guilt for the affair while simultaneously confirming that she'd never really loved me, that our entire marriage had been her settling for someone good enough rather than someone she actually wanted. The letters showed that David had known details about our intimate life that no one outside a marriage should know. My wife had apparently discussed our bedroom with him in ways that violated my privacy completely, had complained about aspects of our physical relationship that I'd thought were private and sacred. He'd written back with suggestions and comparisons, had described what he did differently, had made it clear that my wife preferred him sexually in ways that reading about made me feel humiliated and betrayed beyond the affair itself. Some things should stay private even in betrayal, but my wife had shared everything with this man, had held nothing back, had given him complete access to knowledge about me that should have been hers alone to keep. I'd read through all the letters feeling like I was being destroyed piece by piece, each one revealing new ways my wife had betrayed me, new conversations where she'd complained about me to her lover, new evidence that the marriage I'd valued so completely had meant nothing to her. David's letters showed a 15-year relationship built on the foundation of her dissatisfaction with me, sustained by her complaints about our marriage, fed by her desire to escape a life she found suffocating, despite the fact that I'd done everything possible to make her happy. The letters were proof that I'd never had a chance, that no amount of faithfulness or devotion would have been enough, because the problem wasn't what I did, it was who I was, and you can't fix that no matter how hard you try. At the bottom of the box beneath all of David's letters, I found pages that were different, loose sheets torn from a journal or notebook, pages filled with my wife's handwriting rather than someone else's, and I'd recognized her distinctive cursive immediately, even though I hadn't seen it in 30 years since her death. These weren't letters she'd sent to David, these were notes she'd written to herself. Private thoughts she'd put on paper and hidden in this box, reflections about her life and our marriage and her affair that she'd never intended anyone to read. I'd started going through them slowly, reading her own words about me and our relationship, seeing our marriage from her perspective for the first time and wishing desperately that I hadn't. The earliest pages were from about 15 years into our marriage, right before her affair with David had started based on the dates, and they showed a woman who was deeply unhappy but didn't know how to say it or fix it. She'd written about feeling suffocated by our predictable routine, about how every day was exactly like the one before, about how she'd wake up next to me and feel trapped, even though I'd never done anything to trap her. She'd written that I was a good man, kept repeating that phrase like it was important, but that being married to a good man who never caused problems felt like dying slowly, felt like being buried alive under layers of stability and kindness and devotion that she couldn't breathe through. She'd written about resenting me for being so content with our life, for being happy with our quiet routine when she felt like she was wasting away in it, for never seeming to want anything more than what we already had. She'd described watching me come home from work every day with the same satisfied expression, watching me settle into our evening routine like it was perfect, and feeling furious that I was so completely happy with a life that was killing her inside. She'd written that my contentment felt like an accusation, like proof that something was wrong with her for not being satisfied with a good husband and a stable marriage and a comfortable existence. She'd written pages about the affair with David starting, about how meeting him had felt like waking up from a coma, about how suddenly she'd remembered what it felt like to be excited about seeing someone, to feel butterflies when someone smiled at her, to stay up at night thinking about another person instead of just falling asleep out of habit. She'd described the difference between being with me and being with David in ways that made it clear I'd never had a chance. She'd written that I made her feel safe, but David made her feel alive, that I gave her stability, but David gave her passion, that being my wife was comfortable, but being David's lover made her remember who she'd been before marriage had dulled everything. She'd written about the guilt she felt about the affair, but not the kind of guilt I would have expected. Not guilt about betraying me or breaking her vows or destroying our marriage. Instead, she'd felt guilty about not being able to love me properly, about taking my devotion when she couldn't give the same thing back, about letting me believe our marriage was solid when she'd checked out emotionally years before the affair even started. She'd written that she felt like a fraud every time I told her I loved her, and she said it back without meaning it. Every time I made plans for our future, and she pretended to care. Every time I did something thoughtful, and she had to fake appreciation for gestures that meant nothing to her. She'd described specific moments in our marriage that I'd thought were good, moments I'd treasured and remembered fondly, and had written about how empty those moments had felt to her, how she'd been performing happiness while feeling nothing inside. Our anniversary dinners, where I'd thought we were celebrating our love, she'd written about sitting across from me wishing she was with David instead, forcing herself to smile and act grateful while counting the minutes until she could be alone. Vacations we'd taken that I'd thought were romantic, she'd described as boring obligations, where she'd had to pretend to enjoy my company while fantasizing about being somewhere else with someone else. She'd written about our intimate life in ways that destroyed me, about how being physical with me had become a chore she endured rather than something she wanted, about how she'd started making excuses to avoid it, because it felt wrong to sleep with me when she was in love with David. She'd described lying next to me at night and feeling disgusted with herself for betraying both of us, disgusted with me for being too blind to see what was happening, disgusted with the whole situation but not enough to either end the affair or end our marriage. She'd written that she was a coward who'd rather live with guilt than make the hard choice to be honest about what she really wanted. She'd written about conversations where I'd told her how happy I was in our marriage, how grateful I was to have her, how lucky I felt to have built this life together, and she'd described having to hide her real reaction, which was anger that I was so satisfied with something that made her miserable. She'd written that my happiness felt like a prison because it meant she couldn't complain or ask for changes without seeming ungrateful, couldn't express her dissatisfaction without looking like the problem, couldn't leave without being the villain who'd abandoned a devoted husband for no good reason. My devotion had trapped her not through any fault of mine but because it made her the bad guy if she admitted she didn't want to be married anymore. She'd written about times when she'd thought about leaving me for David, about fantasizing about divorce and starting over, about imagining a life where she could be with the man she actually loved instead of the man she'd married out of practical considerations. But she'd always talked herself out of it, had written that divorce would mean admitting the affair, would mean our daughter finding out, would mean losing financial security, would mean facing judgment from family and friends who all thought we had a perfect marriage. She'd written that staying married to me while loving David was easier than the mess of divorce, that she could have both stability and passion as long as she kept them separate, that the lying was worth it to avoid the consequences of truth. She'd described me in these private notes in ways that showed how little she'd actually known me, despite 35 years of marriage, had reduced me to simple characteristics like reliable and predictable and safe, without seeming to understand that I was a complete person with depth and complexity. She'd written about me like I was a comfortable piece of furniture, something useful and dependable, but not something you'd ever feel passionate about, something you'd keep because it served its purpose but not something you'd miss if it was gone. The casual dismissiveness of how she'd described me to herself was somehow worse than the cruel things David had written, because at least he was an outsider, but she was my wife, and this was how she really saw me. She'd written about our daughter Sarah, about feeling guilty that our marriage was a lie and wondering what that taught our child about love, about whether staying together for appearance's sake was better or worse than divorcing and being honest. She'd written that she hoped Sarah would marry for passion instead of security, would choose love instead of comfort, would be brave enough to leave if she found herself trapped the way her mother was. The idea that she'd seen our marriage as a cautionary tale rather than something positive, that she'd hoped our daughter would learn to avoid what we had, that hurt in ways I couldn't fully process sitting at that kitchen table. The last pages in her journal entries covered the end of her affair with David and what happened after, and reading about that period was somehow worse than reading about the affair itself, because it showed she'd stayed married to me for years after losing the man she actually loved, had chosen to continue the lie even when the reason for lying was gone. She'd written about David ending their relationship about 5 years before she died, about how devastated she'd been when he'd told her he'd met someone else and couldn't keep waiting for her to leave me, about how she'd begged him to reconsider and he'd refused because 15 years was long enough to waste on a woman who'd never choose him. She'd described the months after their breakup as the darkest period of her life, had written about feeling completely hollow and empty, about going through motions at home with me while crying in her car during lunch breaks at work, about seeing David at the office with his new girlfriend and wanting to die from the pain of it. She'd written that losing him felt like losing everything that mattered, that coming home to me every night felt like a punishment, that she'd resented me even more after the affair ended because at least before she'd had David to look forward to, but now she was just stuck in a marriage she'd never wanted with no escape and no hope of anything better. She'd written about considering divorce after David left her, about finally having a reason to end our marriage since the affair that had kept her trapped in it was over. But she'd talked herself out of it for practical reasons. She'd written that divorcing at 53 would mean splitting assets, would mean explaining to everyone why she was leaving after 30 years of marriage, would mean admitting there'd been someone else which would make her look like the bad guy, would mean losing the financial security and social status that came with being my wife. She'd decided staying married to me was easier than the mess of divorce, even without David as a reason to maintain the deception. The entries from those last 5 years of our marriage were the most painful to read because they showed a woman who'd stayed with me purely out of convenience while resenting every moment of it, who'd made the calculated decision that being my wife was better than being alone, even though she didn't love me and wished she was somewhere else. She'd written about looking at me across the dinner table and feeling nothing but irritation, about listening to me talk about my day and wanting to scream at me to shut up, about accepting my affection and physical intimacy while feeling revulsion because I wasn't David and would never be David no matter how devoted I was. She'd described our last few years together as a performance she was exhausted by, about how hard it was to keep pretending she cared when all she felt was emptiness and resentment, about how she'd started withdrawing emotionally because she couldn't keep up the act of being a loving wife anymore. I'd noticed that withdrawal in her last years, had attributed it to her getting older or being stressed about work, had tried harder to be supportive and understanding when what she'd actually needed was for me to stop being so kind because my kindness made her guilt worse. She'd written about that too, about how every nice thing I did felt like an accusation, reminded her that she was living a lie with a man who deserved better. She'd written about her cancer diagnosis 6 months before she died, about how part of her had felt relieved when the doctor said terminal, about how death felt like an escape from a marriage she'd never figured out how to leave. She'd described telling me about the cancer and watching me fall apart with grief and guilt. Had written that my devastation had made her feel even worse because it proved how much I loved her, while she felt nothing but trapped obligation toward me. She'd written that she'd felt guilty about dying and leaving me alone, not because she'd miss me or regret losing our life together, but because her death would hurt me, and I didn't deserve that pain. The final entry was dated a week before she died, written from the hospital when she'd known she had days left, and it was a reflection on our entire marriage that showed me exactly how she'd really felt about the 35 years we'd spent together. She'd written that marrying me had been the biggest mistake of her life, that she'd chosen security over passion when she was young and had spent 3 decades paying for that choice, that she'd wasted her life being married to a good man when what she'd needed was a man who excited her instead of one who was merely devoted. She'd written that she was taking these secrets to her grave because telling me the truth would serve no purpose except to hurt me, that letting me believe she'd loved me was the last kind thing she could do. She'd ended that final entry by writing that she hoped there was no afterlife, because if there was, she'd have to face eternity still tied to a marriage she'd never wanted, still playing the role of devoted wife to a man she'd never loved the way he'd deserved. She'd written that death was her final escape from me, that at least in dying she'd finally be free of the obligation of being my wife, that she was grateful her last thoughts would be her own instead of having to perform gratitude and love for my benefit. Reading those words, written a week before she'd died, knowing I'd sat by her bedside holding her hand while she'd been wishing for escape from me, destroyed something fundamental in how I understood my entire adult life. I sat at that kitchen table until well past midnight, surrounded by the evidence of my wife's betrayal, surrounded by loan documents and receipts and letters and journal entries that destroyed 30 years of grief and 65 years of memories, and I felt something break inside me that I didn't know could break at 88 years old. I'd spent 30 years mourning a woman I'd thought I'd known completely, had grieved the loss of a marriage I'd believed was solid and real, had held onto her memory as something precious and sacred, but all of that had been based on lies and my own willful blindness to who she'd actually been. Every memory I had of our marriage rearranged itself around this new information, like furniture moved in the dark. Every moment I'd treasured revealed itself as something completely different when viewed through the lens of truth instead of the lens of my assumptions. The anniversary dinners where I'd thought we were celebrating our love, she'd been sitting across from me wishing she was with David, performing happiness while feeling trapped. The vacations I'd planned to make her happy, she'd endured as boring obligations while fantasizing about being somewhere else with someone who actually excited her. The quiet evenings at home I'd valued as peaceful companionship, she'd experienced as suffocating routine that made her feel like she was dying slowly. I thought about the 18 months of her cancer treatment, about how I'd sat with her through every appointment and every procedure, about how I'd held her hand and told her we'd get through it together, about how I'd rearranged my entire life to care for her during her illness. The whole time she'd been wishing for escape from me, had seen death as freedom from a marriage she'd never wanted, had been grateful that dying would finally release her from the obligation of being my wife. I'd been devastated by losing her while she'd been relieved to be leaving me. I'd been terrified of life without her while she'd been looking forward to not having to pretend anymore. I thought about her funeral, about standing at her grave crying while our daughter held my hand, about the eulogy I'd given describing her as my soulmate and the love of my life, about how everyone had commented on how devoted I'd been to her and how lucky she'd been to have me. All of that had been based on my belief that she'd loved me back, that our marriage had been mutual, that I was grieving someone who'd valued me as much as I'd valued her. But she hadn't. She'd spent most of our marriage wishing she'd married someone else, had stayed with me out of convenience and cowardice rather than love, had performed the role of devoted wife while privately resenting everything about our life together. I thought about the 30 years since her death, about how I'd kept her photos around my house, about how I'd visited her grave regularly and talked to her like she could hear me, about how I'd told our grandchildren stories about what a wonderful woman their grandmother had been. I'd built an entire identity around being her devoted widower, had defined myself for 3 decades as a man who'd loved his wife completely and lost her too soon, had worn my grief like a badge of honor that showed how deep my love had been. But the woman I'd been grieving didn't exist. The marriage I'd been mourning had been a performance. The love I'd believed in had been one-sided. I thought about all the times over 30 years when people had tried to set me up with women or suggested I start dating, and I'd always said no because no one could replace her, because I'd had my great love and didn't need another one, because being faithful to her memory felt important and right. I'd turned down chances at companionship and possibly happiness because I'd thought honoring my dead wife's memory was more important than my own loneliness, had chosen to be alone rather than betray the love we'd supposedly shared. But there was no love to betray. She'd never felt for me what I'd felt for her. I'd been faithful to a memory that was completely false. I looked at all the evidence spread across my kitchen table and felt rage mixing with the grief, felt anger at her for deceiving me so thoroughly, felt fury at myself for being so blind and trusting that I'd never suspected any of this. The signs had probably been there if I'd been paying attention. The emotional withdrawal in her last years, the times she'd seemed distant or distracted, the way she'd sometimes looked at me like she was seeing someone she didn't particularly like. But I'd been so confident in our marriage, so certain of her love, so trusting in what we'd built together, that I'd explained away anything that didn't fit my narrative of our perfect relationship. I thought about David, about the man who'd slept with my wife for 15 years while shaking my hand at office parties, about how he'd known intimate details about me and our marriage while I'd thought he was just a colleague. I thought about whether other people had known, whether my wife's co-workers had suspected or known about the affair, whether I'd been the only one blind to what was happening while everyone else saw the truth. I'd probably been the subject of pity or jokes, the devoted husband who didn't know his wife was cheating, the fool who kept praising a marriage that was a lie. I thought about our daughter Sarah, about whether she'd known anything about her mother's affair or unhappiness, about whether I should tell her what I'd found, or take these secrets to my grave the way her mother had intended. Sarah had loved her mother, had mourned her death deeply, had named her own daughter after her to honor her memory, and learning the truth would destroy all of that the way it had destroyed me. But keeping it secret felt like continuing the lie, like protecting a woman who'd spent 35 years deceiving me and hadn't deserved my protection or loyalty or anything else I'd given her. I realized I'd spent my entire adult life being faithful to someone who'd never been faithful to me, had built my identity around being a devoted husband to a woman who'd wished she'd married someone else, had wasted decades of potential happiness on a relationship that had only ever been real on my side. I was 88 years old and discovering that the foundation I'd built my life on was completely false, that the marriage I'd thought defined me had been a performance I'd been too trusting to see through, that the woman I'd loved had seen me as an obligation she'd endured rather than a partner she'd chosen. I didn't cry sitting at that kitchen table surrounded by evidence of my wife's betrayal, didn't break down or scream or have any kind of dramatic reaction to learning that my entire marriage had been built on lies and my 30 years of grief had been wasted on someone who'd never loved me. I'd spent 88 years on this earth and had learned that some pain is too big for tears, some betrayals are too complete for emotional displays, some truths are so devastating that all you can do is sit with them in silence and try to figure out what to do with the pieces of your shattered understanding of your own life. I called my attorney the next morning and asked about the forged loan documents, about whether there was anything that could be done 30 years after the fact about debt my wife had created using my forged signature. He told me most of the loans had been paid off during her lifetime using our joint assets, that the few remaining debts had been settled as part of her estate after she died, that legally there wasn't much to pursue at this point except maybe correcting credit records to show the fraud. I told him not to bother, that fixing credit records didn't matter at 88 when I wouldn't be applying for loans anyway, that I just wanted to know whether I'd been legally responsible for debt I'd never agreed to, and the answer was complicated, but mostly no. I thought for a long time about whether to tell Sarah what I'd found, whether to show her the contents of that box and destroy her memories of her mother the way mine had been destroyed. And I decided against it because what purpose would it serve except to hurt her? Sarah was 55 years old with grandchildren of her own, had built her life on memories of a mother who'd loved her, had named her daughter after a woman she'd admired and missed, and learning that her mother had been unhappy in her marriage and had carried on a 15-year affair wouldn't change anything except make Sarah's past feel as false as mine did. I decided some truths are too cruel to share, that protecting my daughter from this pain was more important than my need to have someone else know what I'd discovered. I contacted a lawyer about my estate planning and made some changes I'd been considering anyway, made sure Sarah and her children were taken care of, but also designated significant portions of my assets to charities that supported elderly people and programs that helped people escape unhappy situations. I thought about adding a letter to be read after my death explaining what I'd found in the box and why certain choices were made, but I decided against that too, because Sarah would have to live with that information after I was gone and couldn't help her process it. Better to let her keep believing her mother had been happy, let her maintain the good memories, let the truth die with me since I'd be dead soon enough anyway. I took that wooden box and everything inside it out to my backyard one evening when I knew my neighbors wouldn't be watching, and I burned it all in my fire pit, watched the loan documents and receipts and letters and journal entries turn to ash and smoke. I didn't keep anything, didn't preserve evidence or save letters or hold on to any piece of the truth I'd discovered, just destroyed it all completely and thoroughly so no one else could ever find it and learn what I'd learned. The box itself burned slowly, the old wood resistant to flames, but eventually it caught and burned too. And I stood there watching 35 years of lies and betrayal turn to nothing. Burning the evidence didn't erase what I'd learned or restore my understanding of my marriage to what it had been before I'd opened that box, but it gave me control over the narrative going forward. Let me decide that the truth would die with me instead of poisoning anyone else's memories or relationships. Sarah would keep loving her mother's memory. My grandchildren would keep the stories I'd told them about their grandmother, and no one would know that the devoted marriage everyone had admired had been a performance maintained by one person who'd loved completely and another who'd wished she was anywhere else. I'm 88 years old now, and probably don't have many years left, and I have to figure out how to live whatever time remains, knowing that the central relationship of my adult life was built on deception and one-sided devotion. I gave my wife 35 years of complete faithfulness and got back calculated betrayal and systematic lying. I mourned her for 30 years believing I'd lost someone who'd loved me when really I'd just lost someone who'd been stuck with me. Every memory I have is poisoned now. Every moment I treasured is revealed as something completely different. Every belief I held about my marriage is destroyed. I removed all her photos from my house after burning the box. Couldn't stand looking at her face knowing what I knew now. Couldn't bear seeing her smile in pictures when I knew she'd spent decades wishing she'd married someone else. I stopped visiting her grave because what's the point of visiting someone who saw death as escape from you, who wrote in her final journal entry that dying meant freedom from being your wife. I told Sarah I was simplifying my life and focusing on the present instead of the past, and she accepted that explanation without questioning it because why would she suspect the real reason? People ask me sometimes if I regret opening that box, if I wish I'd left it locked and died still believing my wife had loved me. And I tell them honestly that I don't know, that both options were terrible in different ways. Living with false comfort based on lies versus living with painful truth that destroys your understanding of your own life. Neither choice is good, neither outcome is better. You just pick which kind of damage you can live with and try to survive whatever years you have left. I chose truth over comfort when I opened that box, and now I have to live with that choice. I spent 30 years being faithfully devoted to a dead woman's memory. 30 years honoring a marriage that had been real only on my side. 30 years building my identity around being a loving widower when the woman I'd supposedly lost had spent our marriage wishing she'd married her lover instead. I wasted my entire adult life on someone who'd seen me as an obligation rather than a choice, who'd stayed with me out of convenience rather than love, who'd taken my devotion and given back nothing but performance and resentment. I'm too old to get those years back, too old to find new love or build new relationships. Too old to do anything except sit with this knowledge until I die. For 30 years I never opened my wife's old box, respected her privacy, and trusted that whatever she'd kept locked away was innocent and personal. And yesterday I finally opened it and found loan documents showing $80,000 in forged debt, receipts proving a 15-year affair, letters from her lover describing our marriage as a trap, and journal entries where she'd written that marrying me was the biggest mistake of her life. What I found destroyed 30 years of grief and 65 years of memories, replaced my understanding of a devoted marriage with the truth of systematic betrayal, showed me that the woman I'd loved completely had wished she'd been brave enough to leave me. I burned everything in the box and took the truth to my grave, but burning evidence didn't erase what I'd learned or restore what I'd lost. It just meant I'd carry this knowledge alone until I died, would spend whatever time I had left knowing that the love of my life had never loved me back, had stayed only because leaving was too complicated, had seen death as freedom from being my wife. Some truths are worse than lies. Some discoveries destroy more than they reveal. And I learned too late that the devoted marriage I'd believed in had been a performance maintained by someone who'd spent 3 decades wishing they'd been brave enough to walk away. For 30 years, I never opened my wife's locked box, respected her privacy even after she died. Yesterday, I finally did and found $80,000 in forged loans, 15 years of love letters to her coworker, and journal entries saying marrying me was her biggest mistake. She'd stayed out of convenience, not love. I burned it all. The devoted marriage I'd grieved for 30 years was a lie I'd been too trusting to see.